The wind, a spectral mourner, moved through Rosewood Cemetery like an old forgotten song. Low hollow, saturated with things that used to be with names, erosion had begun to steal, and with the silent, stubborn grief of those left behind. It eddied around weathered headstones, plucked at the brittle autumnal leaves, still clinging to skeletal tree branches, and whispered secrets only the dead and the truly desperate could almost discern. Above, the bruised twilight sky offered no solace, only a reflection of the melancholy clinging to this forgotten edge of town. A place where the neatly manicured lawns gave way to older, wilder sections, less visited, less tended. Here, where the graves grew older, lonelier, and the stones leaned like tired, defeated sentinels watching over a silent, crumbling kingdom, a small boy knelt beside a marker, too plain for the immensity of its meaning. Kevin Dawson was 6 years old, a milestone his mother had promised to celebrate with a superhero-themed party just weeks ago. Now, for the past 14 agonizing days, the fresh, angry scar of her grave had become the desolate epicenter of his crumbling universe. His donated jacket, a faded blue monstrosity, at least 2 sizes too big, its zipper stubbornly refusing to go all the way up, was pulled tight around him, an ill-fitting shield against a chill that seeped deeper than bone, a cold that mirrored the gnawing emptiness inside. The insidious caress of the wind still found its way in raising goose flesh on his thin arms. His knuckles, chapped to a painful, angry pink, were curled tight around a handful of damp grass he'd plucked without realizing each blade a small, desperate anchor to a world that had inexplicably cruelly tilted on its axis. He stared at the freshly turned earth, a raw, dark wound in the muted greens and browns of the landscape, as if it had personally betrayed him. He'd learned about betrayal young, too young. "She's not gone," he whispered, his voice a tremulous, fragile thread against the encroaching dusk, a sound almost stolen by the insistent wind. He pressed his ear closer to the mound. "She's still down there. I can feel her." His breath plumed a tiny white flag of defiance in the cold, uncaring air. His small face, usually quick to light up with a gap-toothed smile, was set in lines of concentration, far too old for his years, lines etched by a sorrow no child should bear. He wasn't just wishing. He was listening with an intensity that bordered on communion, a desperate plea to the unyielding ground. There was no one to answer, only the distant, mournful hum of traffic, from a city that had already moved on its pulse, indifferent to the tiny, broken heart in its midst. The complaining creak of an ancient iron gate, hinges rusted with time, and neglect swung open somewhere in the vast, shadowed expanse of the cemetery. Its groan a lonely counterpoint to the wind's lament. From that distance, Ethan Langley had meant only to pass through a brief, solitary pilgrimage he performed like a penance. A bouquet of stark white lilies, their petals like cold, unblemished porcelain, rested in his hand, and their weight, a physical manifestation of the leaden duty, settled deep in his heart. He wasn't a man given to ritual, but this annual self-flagellation, was inviolable. He came every year, on this precise day, November 8th, the Day of the Dead, a cruel irony not lost on him, to the same secluded, almost hidden grave. His own mother's. It was unmarked by grand pronouncements, no granite angel or flowery epitaph, only by time and the tenacious embrace of the wild ivy that threatened to consume it completely. A grave in what was once the potter's field, forgotten by all but him. He came to speak aloud the things he never possessed the courage or the words to say, when she was living a litany of failures, unspoken regrets, and apologies he knew she could no longer hear, but which he needed desperately to articulate into the void, a catharsis that never quite cleansed. But today, his usually determined, unswerving steps faltered. He saw him before he heard him, a small, hunched figure, a splash of too bright blue against the somber earth, starkly alone by a disturbingly fresh grave. The boy was speaking to the unyielding ground, head bowed as if it possessed the capacity to listen, to respond, to offer comfort, where the world of the living had evidently failed. Ethan paused at the foot of the gentle slope leading to the newer section, the expensive hand-stitched leather of his Italian shoes sinking slightly into the damp-yielding turf. He hadn't meant to interfere. Solitude was a sanctuary he deeply understood, and he guarded with a fierceness born of long practice and deep-seated wounds. But something about the boy, his unnatural stillness, the hushed, fervent intensity of his whispered words, the way he didn't cry loudly, didn't keen or wail like other children he'd occasionally seen here, but held it all in a suffocating secret. Pressing against his small ribs made Ethan stop. It was a familiar posture, that rigid, almost brittle control. He'd worn it himself for decades, a bespoke armor against a world that had taught him too early about loss. The grave beside which the boy knelt bore a name he didn't recognize, etched with a chilling, brutal finality that felt stark even in this place of endings. Claire Dawson. Beneath it, a simple dash, and then the dates. The final date was barely 2 weeks past, a wound still weeping into the indifferent earth, had the disturbed soil a raw contrast to the established grass around it. No flowers adorned it, save the few stray wildflowers bent by the wind. No sentimental photograph offered a glimpse of the life lost, no small, comforting tokens of remembrance. A teddy bear, a child's drawing a favorite trinket. Just the plain cold stone and the raw, unsettled dirt. He felt an unfamiliar, unwelcome pull, a tug of something other than his usual melancholic duty, a discordant note in the symphony of his private grief, and against his better judgment, he stepped closer. The gravel of the narrow path crunched ominously under his shoes, a sound that felt like a profanity in this quiet space of remembrance and sorrow. "Hey there." Ethan's voice was softer than he intended, gruff from disuse during his solitary drive. Kevin flinched, a small, startled animal snapping his head up. His eyes, wide and luminous in the fading light, were rimmed with a fiery red that spoke of countless unshed tears of nights spent wrestling with a grief too big for his small frame. He looked ready to bolt, to vanish into the lengthening shadows like a deer sensing a predator. But something in Ethan's quiet demeanor, perhaps the shared gloom of the cemetery that hung over them both like a shroud, held him rooted. His lips moved, forming silent words, before any sound emerged, as if speech itself was a betrayal of the sacred vigil he was keeping. Then the question delivered, with an unnerving, preternatural calm that hit Ethan like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs, a question no child should ever conceive, let alone utter. "Do you know," Kevin asked, his gaze unwavering, "how to tell if someone's still breathing underground?" Ethan's own breath caught, trapped somewhere between his throat and his heart, a sudden painful constriction. He found himself kneeling, the movement unconscious, instinctual, bringing him eye level with the boy. The wind tugged insistently at the collar of his bespoke wool coat, a mournful accompaniment to this surreal, heartbreaking encounter. He saw the fine tremor in the boy's small, chapped hands, the almost translucent quality of his skin, stretched taut over delicate cheekbones. He noticed, too, the way the boy's oversized jacket sleeves almost swallowed his hands. "No," Ethan said softly, his voice roughened by disuse, and a sudden shocking surge of emotion he couldn't immediately name. It felt like fear, but also like a painful, long-dormant empathy, an echo of a child's terror he thought he'd buried long ago. But that's not something a little boy should ever have to wonder about. Kevin's small chin jutted out a flash of fierce conviction, igniting his tear-bright eyes. His voice, though hushed, carried a serrated edge of certainty that was far, far older than his 6 years. "They lied." He said the words almost spat out, laden with a bitterness that was profoundly unsettling. "They lied about how she died. They said she fell asleep driving, that she hit a tree. But my mom never drove when she was tired, never. She always said it was like playing Russian roulette with angels, and she didn't want to meet any angels before her time." his small hands clenched into fists at his sides, the damp grass he'd been holding crushed between his fingers forgotten. And she loved trees. She taught me all their names. She wouldn't hurt one, not on purpose. He took a ragged, hitching breath, the next words tumbling out in a rush, as if they'd been dammed up for too long, threatening to choke him if he held them in any longer. And they didn't let me see her, not even once, not to say goodbye. They said it was better for me not to. Better for them, maybe. The accusation hung heavy in the cold air. Ethan stared at the grave, at the raw, disturbed dirt that didn't look as if it had settled right, as if the earth itself was restless, uneasy beneath its superficial stillness, subtly different from the other fresh graves he'd noticed. There was something off about it. A subtle unevenness near the headstone he couldn't quite place, a faint indentation that didn't look like natural settling, but which pricked at a primal instinct, a whisper of disquiet. "Who are they, Kevin?" He asked gently, the name a whisper from the boy's earlier fervent words to the ground. Kevin hesitated, his gaze darting around the shadowy expanse of the cemetery, as if invisible ears were listening, as if judgment lurked behind every tombstone. Then, as if reciting a well-rehearsed bitter catechism learned in the school of sudden, inexplicable loss, he said, "The people at the place where she worked. Rose Hill? The man with the shiny predatory teeth that aren't real teeth, I think. Mr. Grayson, Walter Grayson, he came to our apartment once Mom looked scared. And the woman who talks like she's always smiling even when her eyes are mean and cold like frozen puddles. Mrs. Caldwell. She's his assistant, Mom said. She's the one who called the foster lady Shirley. She smiled when she told me Mom was gone forever. A real smile, like she was happy about it." The last words were barely audible, heavy with a child's unforgiving memory of inflicted cruelty, a detail so sharp and precise it made Ethan's stomach clench. Ethan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the biting evening air. Walter Grayson, Rose Hill Centers. The name reverberated through him, a sickening lurch. A conglomerate specializing in elder care, renowned for its glossy brochures depicting serene seniors and its aggressive, highly successful fundraising campaigns targeting the city's elite. Grayson, the master of public relations, the benevolent philanthropist whose name adorned hospital wings and community centers. Ethan himself, through his foundation, had once donated a substantial sum seeking to offset the starkness of his own success with acts of civic virtue. Shaken Grayson's hand at a charity gala. Noted the reptilian coolness in the man's grip, the eyes that never quite matched the practiced effusive smile, a subtle dissonance he dismissed at the time as the quirk of a powerful, perhaps eccentric man. Now the memory felt tainted, imbued with a sinister undertone. What makes you think she's still alive down there?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, dreading the answer, but compelled to know, compelled by the boy's desperate conviction. Kevin unfurled one small cold palm, streaked with dirt and grass stains, and pressed it flat against the damp, unyielding earth of the grave, as if trying to transmit warmth, or perhaps feel a faint pulse from below. "Because I dream about her," he said, his eyes fixed on Ethan's demanding belief, daring him to dismiss it as a child's fantasy. "Every night. And in the dream, she's not dead. She's calling my name, softly, like she's far away and her voice is getting tired." His lower lip trembled violently for a moment before he caught it with his teeth. "And sometimes when I'm very, very quiet right here, right over her heart, I think I can hear her scratching." For a long, suffocating moment, neither spoke. The wind seemed to hold its breath. A single desiccated oak leaf, brown and brittle, spiraled down from a branch above and landed on the raw earth with a soft, rustling sigh, like a final punctuation mark. Scratching. The word hung in the air between them, obscene, horrifying a sound that conjured images from the darkest recesses of the nightmare. I used to dream about my mother too. Ethan said finally, the admission costing him more than he anticipated, a crack appearing in the carefully constructed wall around his own past. She died when I was just a bit older than you. He didn't add that those dreams had been filled with confusion and a desperate, uncomprehending longing. Kevin turned fully towards him, a flicker of desperate connection, of shared understanding in his red-rimmed eyes. Did you ever feel like no one believed you about anything important? All the time. Ethan said the truth of it, a dull ache in his chest. Especially when I didn't have the words to know what I needed them to believe, when the grown-ups had all the answers and none of them made sense. Then Kevin said very quietly, his voice almost a whisper, but carrying the weight of an unbearable suspicion, if someone put her here on purpose to make her go away forever, but she wasn't all the way gone, is that like murder? Ethan looked at the small, determined face shadowed by an almost unbearable grief, yet illuminated by a burning, nascent sense of injustice. He saw not just sorrow, but an unwavering, intuitive conviction that something was terribly wrong. Yes, Kevin. Ethan said, his voice unexpectedly firm, the word resonating with a certainty that surprised even himself. It is. And if that's what happened, someone needs to answer for it. Kevin's voice was a rustle of dry leaves, desperate and pleading. Then can you help me? Can you dig her up? Please, somebody has to check, before it's really, really too late. A sudden violent gust of wind swirled dust and fallen leaves around them, stinging their faces, as if the cemetery itself was agitated by the boy's plea. Ethan stood his legs, feeling strangely unsteady, the lilies in his hand suddenly forgotten. He looked from the raw, silent grave to the small, trembling boy. And then behind them, emerging from the deeper shadows of the older section, an elderly woman approached. She carried a dented, galvanized watering can in one hand and a small trowel in the other. Martha Jenkins. He recognized her from previous visits. She tended some of the older, more neglected cemetery flowers with a quiet, almost religious devotion. She gave Ethan a slight, appraising nod, her gaze sharp, and knowing then, it softened with an unmistakable tenderness as it rested on Kevin. He's been coming here every day since they brought her. She said, her voice raspy with age and the autumn air. Sun up to sundown, pretty near. Always sits quiet right there, always talking to her. Says the same thing over and over. She paused, her shrewd, pale eyes meeting Ethan's, directly holding his gaze. He told me first day he came, just a little thing he looked. My mom didn't die, right, ma'am? They're lying. And you know, Mr. Langley. Ethan supplied his throat tight. Ethan Langley. Mr. Langley. She continued, her gaze flicking to Claire Dawson's plot and then back to him. I've been around this place volunteering, you might say, nigh on 40 years. Seen a lot of grief. Seen how it settles, how the earth takes folks back. Most graves, they settle in a certain way. This one, she gestured with her trowel towards Claire Dawson's plot. This one feels wrong. Like the earth itself is holding its breath, can't quite accept what's in it. There's an unease about it. She lowered her voice, though there was no one else near. The boy, he might be on to something more than just a child's imagining. I've heard whispers before over the years about Rose Hill. Not always a peaceful passing, some say, especially if they don't have close family looking out, asking questions. Had a cousin there myself, Lucille. Sharp as a tack, 1 week gone the next. Said it was pneumonia quick. Family always wondered, but what could we do? Walter Grayson's a big man in this town. Her voice grew heavy with a long-held regret. I saw that boy, Mr. Langley, day after day, heard the whispers about Rose Hill for years, told myself it wasn't my place. An old woman's ramblings who'd listen against a man like Grayson. Maybe if we all hadn't been so quiet for so long looking the other way when things felt off, maybe Claire Dawson might still be here. This town, we all share a bit of this silence, don't we? Living alongside things we know ain't right, because it's easier than making a fuss. Ethan nodded slowly, a cold, hard knot tightening in his stomach. He looked from the resolute old woman, her face a roadmap of years and quiet observations, to the pleading child whose eyes held a desperate hope. He might be right. He said the words in admission, not just to them, but to himself. Martha, your cousin Lucille. When did she pass? Oh, must be 5, 6 years ago now. Martha mused, her gaze distant. Said she was failing fast. But she'd just been laughing with me on the phone the day before they said she took a turn. Always seemed hurried. Something cracked open deep within Ethan Langley. Not grief this time, though its shadow was always present. Something sharper, more urgent, a resonant anger he hadn't felt in years. The past, he realized with a chilling clarity, had a relentless way of repeating itself, of finding new victims, new voices to cry out. Only this time, he was no longer a helpless, confused boy standing at an unmarked grave. This time, he couldn't just walk away. The lilies for his mother suddenly felt heavy, a reminder of a grief, unaddressed, a truth never fully sought. Perhaps in helping this boy, he could finally address his own. Ethan Langley didn't talk about his past. Not to business associates, not to the fleeting women who sometimes shared his bed, not even to his therapist during a brief, unfulfilling foray into self-examination. His reserved nature wasn't cultivated refinement, a carefully constructed veneer of sophisticated detachment. It was a fortress built from painful memory, brick by agonizing brick. Each one laid with the bitter mortar of abandonment, unanswered questions, and the echoing silence of a childhood shattered. He was a tech founder, an innovator whose algorithms had reshaped digital landscapes, an astute investor whose Midas touch turned fledgling startups into global players, a philanthropist whose name was synonymous with generous, albeit impersonal endowments. But the core of Ethan, the blueprint of the man, was a 7-year-old boy named Ethan Miller, sitting on a cold, worn plastic bench in a brightly lit but sterile foster home intake office in rural Ohio, clutching a worn teddy bear, waiting for a mother who never came back from the hospital. Kevin Dawson's whispered desperate words, "Can you dig her up?" echoed in the minimalist expanse of his penthouse apartment, a jarring counterpoint to the panoramic glittering cityscape visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Do you know how to tell if someone's still breathing underground? An adult's worst nightmare, not a question a 6-year-old should ever have to formulate. Ethan had asked a silent, unformed version of it himself all those years ago. His mother vibrant and laughing one day, then hushed whispers, a sterile hospital smell clinging to his father, then just gone. She's with the angels now. They'd told him platitudes that offered no solace, no explanation a child could grasp. Buried in a potter's field, her grave unmarked for years, until he, much older, and with a new name, found the resources to place a simple stone. After his father's own descent into grief and alcohol, Ethan Miller became Ethan Langley, a ward of the state. His first caseworker, Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose face was a perpetual landscape of weary disapproval, had told him bluntly, her words like shards of glass. "Life isn't fair, boy. Nobody owes you anything. You make your own way, or you sink." He'd spent the subsequent decades proving her wrong, or perhaps proving her right in the most defiant way possible. Building an empire not from greed, but from a burning, desperate need to prove he was not nothing, that he mattered, that he could control his own destiny if not the gaping hole left by his past. The next morning, the city still cloaked in a pre-dawn gray. Ethan sat before his laptop, the aroma of strong black coffee, doing little to dispel the chill that had settled in his bones since the encounter in the cemetery. Claire Dawson. He typed her name into multiple search engines, cross-referencing local news archives. The results were unsettlingly sparse. A single brief article from a local news aggregator, barely a paragraph: local nurse dies in tragic single-vehicle accident. Claire Dawson, 32, of Rosewood, reportedly fell asleep at the wheel, survived by her 6-year-old son, Kevin Dawson. No further details at this time. No photograph of Claire. No mention of her place of employment. No service details, no obituary that would normally follow such a tragedy. It felt erased, sanitized, deliberately chillingly curtailed. Grayson's reach, Martha Jenkins had said. How far did it extend? That into the newsrooms. The police department, later that afternoon, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. He drove to St. Michael's Home for Children, the address provided by Martha Jenkins, who'd learned it from a sympathetic cemetery groundskeeper. It was a grim, repurposed Victorian mansion, its once grand facade now faded and peeling, surrounded by a high, unforgiving fence. Through a grimy basement window caked with years of city dust, he saw Kevin. The boy was sitting alone on a bare concrete floor, away from the raucous play of other children, his lips moving silently, his gaze fixed on something unseen. Waiting. Still waiting. The sight ignited a cold, unfamiliar fury in Ethan, a protective rage that startled him with its intensity. Inside, the air was thick with the cloying smell of industrial disinfectant boiled cabbage, and an underlying miasma of despair. Shirley Baxter, the foster lady, Kevin had mentioned, sat at a cluttered front desk, a nameplate identifying her as lead case manager. She was a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and an air of harried bureaucracy chewing gum, with a practiced, almost aggressive indifference. When Ethan, identifying himself smoothly as a distant family friend of Claire's, concerned about Kevin's welfare and potentially interested in becoming a foster parent or benefactor, asked about Claire Dawson, Shirley's eyes, initially welcoming at the mention of benefactor, became guarded, flickering with something that might have been caution or perhaps unease. Claire Dawson, oh yes. Such a tragedy. Shirley said, her voice taking on a professionally sympathetic yet hollow tone. Fell asleep at the wheel, they said. Just awful. She eyed his expensive suit, the tailored cut of his coat, the understated luxury of his watch. Kids, you know, they have such active imaginations when they're grieving. Kevin, he's been particularly imaginative since it happened. Fixated, you might say. Imaginative. Ethan prompted gently, keeping his voice neutral, non-threatening. In what way? Shirley hesitated, tapping a pen against a stack of files. Well, she began, lowering her voice slightly. He gets these ideas about his mother. Unsettling things. Thinks it wasn't an accident. You know, bargaining denial. It's all part of the normal grief process for children, especially with sudden loss. Dr. Ramirez, our consulting psychologist, says it's quite common. She brightened a little too quickly. Rose Hill, where she worked as a nurse, sent over a brief summary of her employment. They expressed deep sorrow, of course. Mentioned some concerns about her recent emotional instability. Apparently, concerns for the boy's welfare had been raised by them even before the accident. Mr. Grayson over at Rose Hill, he's a real pillar of the community, you know. Very generous to places like ours. Funds our entire arts and crafts program. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Ethan listened, a knot of distaste tightening in his gut. Instability. Fixated. Imaginative. A carefully constructed narrative was already in place, painting Claire Dawson as unreliable, and her son as a troubled child lost in fantasy. It made his skin crawl. He left St. Michael's with Shirley's saccharine platitudes and carefully chosen buzzwords clinging to him like cobwebs. That evening, unable to shake the image of Kevin's haunted eyes or Martha Jenkins's somber words, Ethan Langley did something he rarely did. He reached out on a personal matter. He called Tina Morales, a former volunteer coordinator for one of his foundation's early community projects. She was now a hospice nurse in Rosewood, a compassionate, no-nonsense woman he remembered for her fierce dedication. He knew she'd worked at various facilities in the area. When he carefully steered the conversation towards Rose Hill and eventually mentioned Claire Dawson, Tina's breath caught audibly on the other end of the line. Claire Dawson, from Rose Hill. Her voice, usually warm and steady, was suddenly hushed, threaded with an unmistakable tremor of fear. Oh God, Ethan, what about her? Is this about what happened to her? She did work there, yes. Ethan confirmed, his senses instantly sharpening at Tina's reaction. Why do you ask like that, Tina? Did you know her? Claire was a friend? Tina said, her voice laced with a profound sorrow and an undeniable current of fear that made the hairs on the back of Ethan's neck prickle. A good friend. We met at a nursing conference a few years back, kept in touch. She called me maybe a week, 10 days before it happened. She was terrified, Ethan. Absolutely terrified. But determined too. She said something wasn't right at Rose Hill. Patients, good prognosis patients, sometimes just dying too fast. Unexpectedly. DNRs suddenly appearing on charts, sometimes with signatures that looked off. She had names, dates. She was collecting documents, keeping notes. She called it her Rosie the Riveter diary. You know, we can do it. She said she was going to expose the angels with dirty faces at the top. A choked sob escaped her. Then she just vanished. An accident. They called me from Rose Hill, Mrs. Caldwell herself, to inform me, since Claire had listed me as an emergency contact. Sounded so clinical. Did you tell anyone, Tina, the police? Ethan asked, his voice low-controlled. Who was I supposed to tell? Tina's voice was bitter-edged with self-recrimination. Grayson practically owns half this town, Ethan. The police chief plays golf with him. The official line from Rose Hill, personally delivered by Mrs. Caldwell, was that Claire had been suffering from serious mental health issues. Paranoid delusions, increasingly unstable. They even hinted she might have been suicidal. But she wasn't, Ethan. Claire was one of the sanest, most grounded people I knew. She was just honest and brave. Too brave, maybe. Guilt laced her next words. I should have done more. I should have pushed her to go to the state board, not just the local cops. She was scared, but I was scared too. Everyone knows Grayson's vindictive. People who cross him, things happen. What kind of things, Tina? What would make them silence her, possibly kill her? Ethan's voice was dangerously quiet, and the penthouse around him feeling suddenly cold and sterile despite the city lights. Money. Tina said the word flat and ugly. And power. What else is there for men like Grayson? Rose Hill isn't just an elder care facility. It's a cash cow, especially the private pay wing. Prematurely empty beds mean quicker turnover, more admission fees. And the assets of some of these deceased patients, especially those without close family, sometimes they just disappear. Claire was digging into patient finances, wills, suddenly altered just before a patient's rapid decline. She mentioned a particular notary, a guy named Carl Newman, who seemed to always be around when these convenient changes happened. And she told me about a locket, a beautiful antique silver thing with a tiny sapphire chip belonging to a Mrs. Albright, one of her favorite patients. Mrs. Albright treasured it. Claire swore she saw Lydia Caldwell Grayson's right-hand woman wearing that exact locket at a staff meeting a week after Mrs. Albright passed peacefully in her sleep. Ethan felt a cold dread seep into him. The notebook Tina. Her Rosie the Riveter diary. Did you ever see it? Did she tell you what she planned to do with it? A small spiral-bound notebook with a cheap floral cover, the kind you buy at a drugstore, Tina confirmed. She showed it to me once, tapped it, and said, "This is their undoing, Tina." After she was gone, I tried to get her personal effects from her locker at Rose Hill. They gave me a worn cardigan and an old romance novel. No purse, no phone, no keys, and definitely no notebook. Mrs. Caldwell herself oversaw the clear-out, said everything else was either contaminated biohazard due to the nature of her death or had been turned over to the authorities as part of the accident investigation. Lies, all lies. Tina's voice broke. Claire told me that last terrified call that she was going to make a copy of the important pages, mail it to a cousin or an aunt, someone out of state. A lawyer, she thought. I don't know if she ever got the chance. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He walked the length of his apartment, the city lights a cold, indifferent witness. He thought of his own mother, nameless in a potter's field for too long. He thought of Kevin, small and alone, pressing his ear to the cold earth, listening for a heartbeat that wasn't there, but for a truth that might be. He thought of Claire Dawson, brave and honest, erased by a system designed to protect the powerful. I never left that foster home, he whispered to the unblinking panorama of the city. The boy inside, he's still there, still waiting for someone to acknowledge the truth to make things right. He knew with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his soul what he had to do. Unearth every secret, every lie, every corruption. Give Kevin his mother's truth. And perhaps finally, after all these years, let that small, waiting boy inside himself walk away from that cold plastic bench free. The following afternoon, Ethan found Kevin not at St. Michael's, but at a bleak, windswept park near the children's home. The park was a patchwork of worn grass and muddy puddles, equipped with a few pieces of faded, rusting play equipment. The boy sat alone on a rickety wooden bench, away from the few other children, whose shrieks and laughter felt alien in the grim surroundings. He was drawing abstract, agitated patterns in the damp earth at his feet with a broken stick, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ethan approached gently, his footsteps muffled by the soft ground, not wanting to startle him. "Hey," he said softly, sinking onto the bench a respectful distance away. "Remember me, from the cemetery?" Kevin looked up, his eyes, those old haunted eyes widening first with recognition, then immediately clouding over with a guarded watchfulness. He clutched the stick tighter. "I didn't tell anybody," he said, his voice low, almost a mumble. "About you? Or what I said? Shirley says I make things up. Most people don't come back when I tell them stuff." "I used to think the same thing," Ethan said, his gaze drifting to the stark, skeletal trees lining the park. "When I was about your age, a little older, maybe I waited for someone too. For a long, long time. Someone who never came back." A flicker of understanding, of shared experience, crossed Kevin's small face. "Your mum," he whispered, his eyes searching Ethan's. Ethan nodded, the familiar ache constricting his chest. "She got sick. Really sick. No one told me much, not in words a kid could understand. They just said she was tired then, that she'd gone to a better place. There was no chance to say goodbye properly, not really. They expected me to just be okay to move on." He looked at Kevin. "It's hard to be okay when you don't understand, isn't it? They said my mum drove into a tree." Kevin said, his voice barely audible above the sigh of the wind through the branches. He poked viciously at the dirt with his stick, drawing a crude car and a tree, then stabbing the car. She wouldn't do that. She was careful, always. She always said, "Slow and steady wins the race, my little star." That's what she called me. He bit his lip, his small chin trembling. They didn't let me see her, not even at the place with all the flowers and sad music people go to. Shirley said it was better that way for me. But I needed to tell her I loved her one more time. Better for who? Ethan murmured, echoing his own earlier thought. It's amazing how often it's better for the child when adults want to avoid difficult conversations, or worse, when they might be trying to cover up something. He paused, then asked gently, "Your mom, did she have any special marks? Something only you might remember?" Kevin's stick snapped in his hand. He looked down at the broken pieces, his lower lip quivering. "She used to sing to me," he said, sharing a precious, fragile secret. About a little star finding its way. And she had a scar. Right here. He touched his own left wrist. Shaped like a tiny crescent moon. From when she fell out of a treehouse when she was a girl. I used to trace it with my finger when she read me stories. She said it was her good luck moon. Ethan swallowed hard, the image stark and poignant. A crescent moon scar. A detail easily overlooked, easily dismissed, but profoundly real to this child. Sometimes people, he said carefully, choosing his words. The ones who write the official reports, the ones who decide what's better for us, they forget those kinds of details. Or they don't think they're important. But they are, aren't they? Kevin looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears, pleading. Do you really think she's still down there in that box?" He whispered, his voice raw. "That they made a mistake or something worse, like you said, about answering for it?" Ethan hesitated for a long moment at the weight of the boy's question and the enormity of the implications settling upon him. He could offer platitudes, easy reassurances. He could tell Kevin to trust the adults, that everything would be all right. But he remembered his own childhood, the burning injustice of being unheard, disbelieved. He met Kevin's gaze. "I think something's not right, Kevin," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Terribly not right. I don't know yet if it's what you fear most about her being down there. But I believe you. I believe your mom wouldn't drive tired. I believe she loved trees. And when something feels that wrong, when a little boy who loved his mom so much feels it in his heart, you don't just walk away. You ask questions. You push. Sometimes you have to dig. Metaphorically, at first at least. They don't like questions," Kevin stated flatly, his voice devoid of emotion, a child reporting a known, dangerous fact. "Mr. Grayson, he told Shirley at the children's home that I asked too many questions, that I was becoming unhealthily fixated on my mother's death. Shirley told me to try and think about happy things instead. Fixated is what they call it when a child won't swallow a lie they're being fed." Ethan said, a grim understanding dawning. Grayson was already working to discredit the boy, to pathologize his grief and his intuition. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, pulled out a small, high-quality notepad and a slim, expensive pen. He wrote down his personal mobile number. "This is my number, Kevin," he said, tearing off the sheet and folding it carefully. "If you ever need to talk, if Shirley or anyone else tries to stop you asking questions, or if you remember something else, anything at all about your mom, about Rose Hill, about Mr. Grayson or Mrs. Caldwell, anything you think might be important, even if it seems small." Kevin took the folded paper, his small fingers closing around it as if it were a lifeline. He looked up at Ethan, his face earnest, a fragile hope dawning in his eyes. "Mr. Langley," he said, his voice suddenly stronger, You're the first grown-up who looked like they really believed me. Really believed me." Ethan could only nod a silent promise, passing between them, a bond forged in shared grief and a nascent quest for truth. "I believe you, Kevin. And I won't stop until we find that truth, whatever it may be." This time he vowed someone would come back for the child left behind. This time the digging in every sense of the word would truly begin. He had a feeling the stick figures Kevin drew in the dirt were just the beginning of a much darker picture. Before she was a hastily filled grave and a whisper in the dirt, Claire Dawson was a quiet flame of compassion and diligence on the night shift at Rose Hill Elder Care Center. Amongst the hushed corridors, the beeping monitors, and the rustle of starched uniforms, the staff often called her Dependable Claire. She was the one who always knew where the extra supplies were, who could calm the most agitated dementia patient with a soft word and a gentle touch, who never complained about extra duties. But to the patients, especially those whose families rarely visited, whose nights were long and often filled with fear or loneliness, she was sunrise. Not just because her shift often ended as the first light touched the windows, but because she had kind hands, a listening ear, and an uncanny ability to remember everyone's story, their grandchildren's names, their favorite flavor of ice cream, the songs that made them smile. The fluorescent lights in the corridor, near room 12B, always flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows on the polished linoleum. Claire had once joked to Tina Morales, during a shared coffee break, that it was the building's faltering heartbeat, a moment of levity, that felt distant now. She wasn't smiling, not even a little, the night she found a newly printed and inserted DNR Do Not Resuscitate order on Mrs. Abigail Tomlin's chart. Mrs. Tomlin, a spirited woman of 82, with a mischievous twinkle in her eye, had been recovering remarkably well from a bout of pneumonia. Just that morning, she'd been excitedly telling Claire about her granddaughter's upcoming school play, eager to be well enough to attend. There was no record of family consultation for the DNR, no previous discussion noted in her file. By the following evening, when Claire returned for her shift, Mrs. Tomlin was gone, aspirated quietly in her sleep. The official record stated a neat, sterile summary signed by Dr. Peterson, a physician known throughout Rose Hill for his unquestioning loyalty to Walter Grayson and his swift, often cursory patient evaluations. It felt profoundly, sickeningly wrong. "I'm telling you, Tina," Claire had whispered fiercely in the cramped, windowless break room a few days later, her hand trembling so much her coffee sloshed over the rim of the styrofoam cup. She wasn't ready. That DNR appeared out of nowhere. There was no reason for it, and she's not the only one. 3, maybe 4 long-term patients, all relatively stable, gone abruptly in the last few weeks. All of them suddenly had new DNRs on their charts, no proper family calls logged. Her voice cracked with a mixture of grief and outrage. Old Mr. Petrov, who was so looking forward to his son's visit from overseas, was asking me to help him write a letter just last week full of plans. Then suddenly took a turn for the worse. Another peaceful passing. His son never made it in time. Tina, stirring her own coffee with a plastic spoon, looked alarmed, her usually cheerful face drawn with concern. "Claire, for God's sake, be careful. You know how Grayson and Caldwell are. They don't like complications. They don't like staff who ask too many questions. Remember Sarah Jenkins from the day shift started asking about medication discrepancies for patients in the hospice wing. Suddenly she was deemed unfit for duty after a thorough review of her performance. Her career was ruined." Claire's gentle eyes, usually so full of warmth, glinted with a steely resolve. Careful didn't help Mrs. Tomlin, Tina, or Mr. Henderson, the lovely old veteran in 9C, who loved my homemade cinnamon muffins and told stories about the war. His nephew was devastated, threatened to sue, said his uncle was fine the day before. Then suddenly he went completely quiet after Lydia Caldwell had a sympathetic private chat with him. Shortly after, Rose Hill made a generous, unsolicited contribution to the nephew's struggling local business. It was all hushed up. She reached into her large tote bag and pulled out a spiral-bound notebook, its cover adorned with a cheerful, somewhat incongruous pattern of blooming roses and bluebirds. Her Rosie the Riveter diary, as she'd whimsically dubbed it. "I'm keeping track," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, flipping through pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. "Dates, times, medication changes. I've noticed that weren't ordered, overheard conversations between Caldwell and Peterson, missing personal items. That slimy notary, Carl Newman, the one with the bad toupee and the shifty eyes, he always seems to show up just before these sudden declines, usually when a will needs amending or a power of attorney needs signing over. Mrs. Eleanor Albright, the sweet lady in room 10A, had this exquisite antique silver locket, a family heirloom star-shaped with a tiny sapphire in the center. She showed it to me many times, told me her husband gave it to her on their first anniversary, 2 days after she passed peacefully. I swear I saw Lydia Caldwell wearing a locket that looked identical at a senior staff meeting. When I discreetly asked her about it, admiring it, Caldwell just smiled that cold smile of hers and said, "Oh, this old thing, it was a gift." A gift from who I wanted to scream. Suddenly, the break room door swung open, and Walter Grayson himself stood framed in the doorway, Lydia Caldwell, a silent, imposing shadow just behind him, her presence radiating a palpable chill. Grayson's smile was wide, predatory, not reaching his eyes. "Ladies." Grayson purred, his voice smooth as silk, yet with an underlying roughness that reminded Claire of a cat's tongue. "Burning the midnight oil. Are we? Dedication like yours is what makes Rose Hill a beacon of compassionate care." His gaze, sharp and unsettlingly perceptive, flickered dismissively over Tina, then lingered for a moment too long on Claire's notebook, which she instinctively tried to cover with her hand. "Loyalty, Claire," he said, strolling into the room and casually pouring himself a coffee from the communal pot, stirring it with deliberate slowness, "is a quality even rarer than dedication in this day and age, and I find far more valuable." He took a sip, then pinned her with his gaze, his smile fading into something more calculating. "Sometimes, Claire, with the utmost compassion and professional integrity, of course, we have to assist the inevitable process for those who are truly suffering, those for whom prolonging life would be a cruelty. Help it along, discreetly ease their passage. A kindness, you understand. A necessary, albeit difficult, aspect of providing truly holistic end-of-life care. You understand the profound necessity of such discretion, such compassionate facilitation." His emphasis on certain words was like a cold finger tracing her spine. Claire's jaw clenched, her knuckles white where she gripped her coffee cup. She could feel Tina's warning gaze on her. "I understand, Mr. Grayson," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the frantic hammering of her heart, "that our primary duty is to advocate fiercely for our patients' well-being and their clearly expressed wishes as they define them. Honest care, transparent care that upholds the dignity and autonomy of every individual entrusted to us. That's the oath I took and the standard I strive to meet every single shift." Grayson's smile returned, but it was chilling now, devoid of any warmth, like the glitter of ice. "Honesty, my dear Claire," he said softly, his voice a dangerous caress, "is often subjective, wouldn't you agree? A matter of perspective. Let's make sure we all remember what truly matters here at Rose Hill. Our reputation, our commitment to efficiency and the comfort of our residence. He set his barely touched coffee cup down and turned to leave Caldwell falling into step behind him, her heels clicking on the linoleum like the ticking of a sinister clock. Tap, tap, tap. A warning. As the door clicked shut, Claire sagged against the counter, her breath escaping in a shaky sigh. He knows, she whispered to Tina, her face pale. Or at least, he strongly suspects. That wasn't a conversation. It was a threat. Tina squeezed her hand, her own visibly trembling. Claire, please let it go. It's too dangerous. What if he fabricates something against you? What about Kevin? You have to think about Kevin. Claire's face hardened, a sudden fierce protectiveness erasing the fear in her eyes. It's precisely because of Kevin that I can't let this go, she said, her voice regaining its strength. What kind of world am I leaving for him if people like Grayson can get away with this, with treating human lives as commodities? I'm making a full copy of the most important entries tonight, mailing it registered post to my Aunt Millie in Arizona first thing in the morning. She's a retired prosecutor, tough as nails, knows her way around the law. If something happens to me, Tina, promise me you'll contact her. Promise me you'll make sure she gets what she needs to follow through. Her heart pounded in her chest. Grayson's words echoed in her mind, compassionate facilitation. He hadn't denied anything. He'd bloody well justified it, cloaked it in sickening euphemisms. She had looked into the abyss, and it had smiled back with Walter Grayson's face. The weight of what she was doing, the potential cost, settled upon her heavy and cold. Driven by a cold fury and the memory of Kevin's haunted face, Ethan Langley began to move, with the calculated precision that had built his empire. His first call was to James Rowe, a once respected investigative reporter, whose career had been derailed years ago after a scathing exposé on a corrupt city councilman, a councilman who coincidentally had strong ties to Walter Grayson. Rowe, now a cynical, bourbon-soaked freelancer, chasing ambulance stories and barely making ends meet, met Ethan in a dimly lit, smoky bar that smelled of stale beer and regret. Walter Grayson, Rowe said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes narrowed with a familiar, weary bitterness. He's got layers like a rotten onion, and a long memory. Claire Dawson. Tragic car accident. So, Mr. Smith. He used the pseudonym Ethan had given. Why are you really interested? Altruism or something more personal? I have compelling reasons to believe her death wasn't an accident. Ethan stated, omitting Kevin for now, but detailing Tina's fearful account of Claire's whistleblowing and her Rosie the Riveter diary. The official story feels too neat, too convenient for Rose Hill. I need you to look into Sergeant Miles Corbin, the first officer on the scene of Claire's accident. Discreetly. See what shakes loose. A week later, Rowe reported back, his voice gravelly over the phone. Corbin seems officially clean respected even. But I got a source, a rookie who was with him that night, says Corbin was unusually tense. Mentioned off record to the kid that the scene felt too neat. Car totaled against the tree, but not much debris on the road itself. No skid marks you'd expect from someone losing control. Almost like the car was placed there after the fact. Also, turns out there was a localized power outage on Old Mill Road for about 2 hours that night. No official explanation, just transformer malfunction. Streetlights would have been out. Convenient for an accident on a dark, lonely road. Ethan felt a chill. Anything else? Yeah. Rowe grunted. Talked to a bartender at the Last Drop, a dive bar not far from Rose Hill. Name's Sal. Claims Claire Dawson was in there the night of the accident alone, drinking heavily, crying, talking about how she couldn't go on. Said she seemed suicidal. Fits the unstable narrative Rose Hill pushed a little too perfectly. Smells like a plant to me. Sal got cagey when I pushed for details. Ethan's jaw tightened. a bought and paid for witness to solidify the suicide accident angle. Grayson was thorough. Meanwhile, Tina Morales, her initial fears slowly being overtaken by a guilt-ridden courage, had been making her own quiet inquiries. She connected Ethan with Maria Santos, a former Rose Hill nursing assistant. Maria, a nervous woman, who met Ethan in a bustling coffee shop, her eyes darting around, spoke in hushed tones. "I was fired from Rose Hill about 6 months before Claire died," Maria whispered, twisting a paper napkin in her hands. "I questioned a DNR that suddenly appeared on the chart of a wealthy patient, a Mr. Goldstein. He'd been cheerful making plans. Then Mrs. Caldwell and Dr. Peterson had a private consultation with him. Next morning, there was the DNR. Carl Newman, the notary, had been there the day before. 2 days later, Mr. Goldstein was gone. His morphine dosage in the final hours, it seemed very high, much higher than his reported pain levels." Her voice trembled. "Claire was kind to me afterwards. She told me, 'Be careful, Maria. They don't like us asking questions. But don't you ever stop caring.' She said she was keeping notes too about everything. She said she'd made copies of her notebook. One she was going to hide in a special place like a dead drop, she joked. Another she was trying to get to her aunt." The special place resonated with Ethan. He thought of Kevin. A few days later, Martha Jenkins, the observant woman from the cemetery, contacted Ethan. She'd found something near Claire Dawson's grave. While tidying up, caught in the rough grass at the edge of the plot, a small tarnished St. Christopher medal, its chain broken, half buried in the mud. It was blue enamel with a silver chain. When Ethan, with a heavy heart, showed it to Kevin during a carefully supervised visit at St. Michael's, the boy's eyes widened. "That's Mama's," he cried, reaching for it. She always kept it hanging from her rearview mirror in the car. For luck, it was a gift from Grandma. The police said they couldn't find it after the crash. Ethan felt a jolt. If the car was staged, as Corbin's rookie partner suspected, then this medal likely dislodged during a struggle or the staging itself. And overlooked by the perpetrators in the dark was a crucial piece of physical evidence placing Claire, or at least something of hers, at the gravesite beyond her burial. But who would have had it? Ethan asked gently, "Your mom, did she ever talk about a special hiding place for important things, letters, papers?" Kevin frowned in concentration, then his face lit up. Her treasure box. It was an old shoebox covered in seashell paper. She kept all her important papers in there, like my birth certificate and old photos. And she had Rosie. Her big fern on our old apartment's back porch. She said Rosie was a good secret keeper. The apartment. It would have been sealed by the police after Claire's death, then likely cleared out or relet. But if there was a chance, Ethan, using his considerable financial clout and leveraging his carefully cultivated image as a philanthropist interested in Kevin's welfare, even hinting at establishing a significant trust fund for the boy, which got Shirley Baxter's immediate attention, managed to gain supervised access to Claire Dawson's former apartment. Detective Frank Rourke, a veteran homicide detective with weary eyes and a reputation for being stubbornly old school and immune to political pressure, was assigned to accompany him. Rourke had heard whispers about Rose Hill for years, faint, unproven, but persistent. He was intrigued by Langley's interest. Apartment 2B was small, tidy, yet poignant with the atmosphere of an abruptly interrupted life. A half-finished cup of tea on the nightstand, a book splayed open, a child's drawing of a smiling sun taped to the refrigerator. The treasure box in Claire's cramped bedroom closet yielded precious memories. Faded photographs, birthday cards, Kevin's first-grade report card. But no diary, no damning evidence. Ethan's heart sank. Then he remembered Rosie. The back porch was tiny, cluttered with a few pots of struggling plants. And there in the corner was a large, slightly droopy Boston fern. Rosie. Ethan knelt, his expensive trousers creasing in the dust. He gently felt around the base of the plant, his fingers brushing against the cool, damp soil. Nothing. He carefully sifted through the top layer, and then his fingers brushed against something yielding but firm plastic. He dug a little deeper. A Ziploc bag coated in earth. His pulse quickened. Inside, wrapped carefully in another layer of plastic grocery bag, was a spiral-bound notebook with a faded floral cover. Roses and bluebirds. Back in the secure, anonymous office he used as a base for this investigation, miles from his opulent penthouse, Ethan opened the notebook. The pages were filled with Claire Dawson's neat, legible script. It was far more damning than he could have imagined. Patient initials, dates of sudden decline, suspicious medication changes, direct quotes from Grayson and Caldwell overheard during hushed conversations in hallways or near the nurse's station. Need to make it quick. The family's getting anxious. Ensure Tomlin's substantial charitable bequest to the Rose Hill Foundation is expedited. Caldwell confirmed the revised will for Peterson to sign off on. There were notes on financial irregularities she'd peripherally observed, offshore accounts. Grayson had allegedly bragged about shell corporations linked to Rose Hill that seemed to absorb donations. Claire had even developed a chilling code, angels with dirty faces, for Grayson and Caldwell and their compassionate facilitation program. For what she suspected was a systematic culling of inconvenient or wealthy patients. The final entries were increasingly frantic, written in a shakier hand. Oct 25GC, no, I suspect something. Grayson's chat today was a clear threat. Caldwell watches me like a hawk. Made a copy of key pages. Gave sealed package to T to hold, told her only open if something happens. Mailed another to Aunt M. So scared can barely sleep. Kai senses it. Oct 26. Car acting funny on the way home this morning. Brakes feel soft, almost hit a dog. Checked the brake line when I got home. Looked like it might have been tampered with, or am I being paranoid? Oct 27. Overheard LC on phone in her office door ajar. Talking low, angry. Mentioned Old Mill Road. No lights after midnight. Clean job, no mistakes. Corbin is manageable on the payroll for years for small things. Oh my God, they're planning something. For me. Taking Kay to Millie's in Arizona first thing tomorrow, then going to the state authorities. Have to get him out. That was the last entry. The day before her accident on Old Mill Road. Corbin wasn't clean. He was on Grayson's payroll. Ethan's blood ran cold. He immediately called Tina Morales. Tina, he said, his voice urgent. Claire's notebook. You said she gave you a copy of sealed package. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Oh God, Ethan. Yes, she did. The day before, she met me after her shift looking terrified. Gave me a thick manila envelope sealed with packing tape. Said, don't open this unless something happens to me. If it does, get it to my Aunt Millie in Arizona. Her address is inside. I was so scared after she died. I hid it. I still have it, tucked away in my attic. A second copy, and Millie in Arizona. Claire's aunt, the retired prosecutor. The unraveling thread was leading deeper, pulling taut, and it was wrapped around Walter Grayson's throat. Millicent Millie McGregor. Claire Dawson's aunt was indeed, as Claire had described, tough as nails. A woman in her late 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a no-nonsense demeanor honed by decades as a prosecutor in Scottsdale, Arizona. She greeted Ethan on her sun-drenched patio with a firm handshake and an appraising gaze. An identical floral-covered notebook, Claire's duplicate, lay on the wrought iron table between them, alongside a heavily annotated printout of what Ethan recognized as Arizona state law regarding suspicious deaths and interstate conspiracies. "Mr. Langley," she said, her voice crisp and clear, gesturing for him to sit. I had a feeling someone would eventually come asking more pointed questions than the local Rosewood PD seemed capable of. Claire was my sister's only child. A good woman. A brave woman. Her gaze softened for a moment, then hardened again as she tapped the notebook. This, what they did to her, what they were doing to those poor souls. It's monstrous. Yes, she confirmed the package from Claire posted the day before her death had arrived. The notebook and something else, an encrypted flash drive. Claire was always meticulous. Millie said, a sad pride in her voice. She said if anything happened, the key to the flash drive was in the lullaby she always sang to Kevin. Ethan felt a chill. "Little star lost and bright, find your way back to the light." He'd heard Kevin humming it. He provided the phrase to Millie, who typed it into her laptop. The flash drive decrypted, revealing a meticulously organized goldmine scanned copies of altered DNR forms, some with signatures that were clearly different from authenticated patient signatures Millie had already begun to source from other documents. Forged will addendums notarized by the same Carl Newman on multiple occasions. Copies of internal Rose Hill memos from Lydia Caldwell, detailing strategies for optimizing bed turnover rates during peak flu season and managing family expectations post-bereavement to minimize legal friction. Most damningly, there were financial statements Claire had somehow managed to photograph, showing convoluted transfers of funds from patient bequests and Rose Hill Foundation accounts to Grayson-controlled shell corporations with opaque names. Claire was also suspicious about Grayson's wife, Maria. Millie added, her eyes narrowing. She'd overheard a vicious argument between them once. Claire got the impression Maria Grayson was trapped, perhaps even frightened of her husband. Claire noted Maria making several discreet, large cash withdrawals from a joint account, almost as if she were squirreling money away. A possible weak link, or just another victim. Ethan shared his own findings, Rose's investigation into Sergeant Corbin, and the too neat accident scene, the suspicious power outage, Sal, the bartender's coerced testimony, Maria Santos's fear, the St. Christopher medal found at the gravesite. Millie listened intently, her expression grim. Corbin. A dirty cop makes this infinitely more dangerous, but also potentially easier to crack if he can be flipped. The medal is an anomaly they wouldn't have planned for. Sal, the bartender, needs to be leaned on. Newman, the notary, is key for the financial fraud. She was already thinking like a prosecutor piecing together a case. Back in Rosewood, Ethan felt the noose tightening, but also the risks escalating. He put more pressure on James Rowe. Newman needs to be found, and Sal. Lean hard. Rowe reinvigorated by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, and perhaps by Ethan's generous retainer delivered. Carl Newman, it turned out, had skipped town, last seen buying a one-way bus ticket to somewhere vague down south. Spooked. But Sal, the bartender, faced with Rowe's relentless questioning, and a veiled hint about obstruction of justice, cracked. He confessed that Lydia Caldwell herself had visited him, paid him $500 in cash to tell anyone who asked that Claire Dawson had been drunk and suicidal that night. She'd even been careless enough to leave him with a Rose Hill business card with her direct line circled, in case of any problems. The St. Christopher medal, the too neat crash site, Corbin's likely involvement, Newman's flight, Sal's coerced testimony, the two notebooks, the flash drive. It was a cascade. But the most pressing concern was Kevin. If Grayson sensed the net tightening, the boy was a vulnerable loose end, the initial spark of this whole dangerous inquiry. Ethan, using a combination of his considerable resources and Millie McGregor's legal acumen navigating the interstate bureaucracy arranged for Kevin to be moved to a secure private care facility in a different state, under an assumed name far from Grayson's reach. He assured a reluctant Shirley Baxter it was a temporary measure for Kevin's emotional well-being. A fiction she readily accepted when coupled with another substantial donation to St. Michael's. With Kevin safe, Ethan prepared his next move. He contacted Detective Frank Rourke. "I have what you asked for, Detective," he said. "And more. Concrete evidence, testimony, financial trails. Enough to paint a very clear picture of what Rose Hill has become under Walter Grayson." He also made a call to his PR firm instructing them to arrange a press conference for the newly formed Claire Dawson Justice Fund, with a vague but ominous promise of forthcoming revelations about misconduct in elder care facilities. He knew word would get back to Grayson immediately. Let him sweat. Let him wonder just how much they knew. The light, cold, and hard was finally beginning to break through the cracks in Grayson's gilded facade. Ethan flew back to Scottsdale for a strategy session with Millie. The decrypted contents of the flash drive were even more damning than they'd initially realized. Alongside the altered DNRs and wills, there were emails Claire had managed to access from Caldwell's unsecured outbox discussing problematic patients and the expedited bereavement protocols. There were also partial transcripts of conversations Claire had painstakingly recorded on a micro-cassette recorder, holding it concealed in her pocket. Fragments of Grayson outlining the economic benefits of proactive end-of-life management. "My niece was astonishingly thorough and unbelievably brave." Millie said, her voice thick with a mixture of sorrow and fierce pride. "This is enough to bury them." But Grayson's local influence, even his state-level political connections, they're extensive. "We need something undeniable, something that ties him or Caldwell directly to Claire's death, not just the financial crimes or the patient neglect." She confirmed Claire's suspicion about Maria Grayson seemed astute. "I've had feelers out. Maria Grayson is rarely seen without her husband lives like a bird in a gilded cage. There are whispers of Walter's controlling nature, his temper. If she knows something, fear is keeping her silent." Back in his Rosewood operations base, a sterile rented office far from his usual sphere, Ethan's team of forensic accountants, vetted for utmost discretion, confirmed the financial trails Claire had uncovered. Funds siphoned from Rose Hill through layers of shell corporations ultimately landed in accounts directly controlled by Walter Grayson. It was a meticulously constructed web of fraud. Ethan felt a surge of grim satisfaction. This was hard, irrefutable evidence for at least one set of crimes. Then came the twist, a development he hadn't anticipated, certainly not from his cynical, world-weary investigator. James Rowe met Ethan in their usual booth at the bar, but his demeanor was different. The usual rumpled cynicism was still there, but it was tinged with an uncharacteristic gravity and almost palpable agitation. He slid a small digital audio recorder across the sticky table. Ethan Rowe began, his voice rougher than usual. "There's something I need to tell you. About why Grayson, why he thought I might be flexible, as you so politely put it. Why he wasn't initially worried about me sniffing around." Rowe took a deep slug of his bourbon, then confessed. Years ago, buried under a mountain of gambling debts, his career already faltering, Walter Grayson had approached him. Grayson had helped him out, paid off his debts in exchange for Rowe killing a story he was developing about certain financial irregularities and an unusual spike in patient mortality rates at Rose Hill's newly opened hospice wing. "He owned me." Rose said, the shame heavy in his voice, his gaze fixed on the condensation rings on the table. "I buried the story, took his money, and have been living with it ever since. When you came to me, Langley, looking into Claire Dawson, I saw a chance, a long shot. Maybe to clear some of the red from my own goddamned ledger. He nodded at the recorder. After our first meeting, and after hearing about Tina's suspicions regarding Lydia Caldwell, I had a bad feeling she was central to the more direct, dirty work. I took a risk. Got access to Rose Hill's public financial filings as a pretext, then planted this bug in Caldwell's company car during a supposed routine maintenance check. I conned a contact at the garage into letting me observe. It's a long shot, usually picks up nothing but traffic noise, pop music, or drive-through orders. He pressed play. Lydia Caldwell's sharp, precise voice filled the quiet hum of the bar, cold and clear, unmistakably hers. She was speaking to someone whose gravelly voice Ethan vaguely recognized from surveillance photos Rowe had taken of known low-level enforcers sometimes seen around Grayson's less reputable business ventures. A man named Benny, the Brick Rizzoli. Dawson's becoming too much of a liability. Snooping where she doesn't belong, getting agitated, talking to others. Walter wants it handled, permanently. Old Mill Road, late tomorrow night. She works nights, leaves around 11. Make it look like a tragic accident. Single vehicle ran off the road, hit that big oak by the culvert. No witnesses. Sergeant Corbin will manage the scene afterwards. He knows which side his bread is buttered on. He's been useful before. And make goddamn sure that damned floral notebook she's always scribbling in disappears with her. If you find it, burn it. No loose ends, Benny. Walter's very particular about loose ends. The recording was chillingly explicit, a cold-blooded order for murder. It was the irrefutable proof, the smoking gun directly connecting Lydia Caldwell, and by clear extension, Walter Grayson, to orchestrating Claire Dawson's murder. This, Rose said, his voice hoarse, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for his bourbon, is my penance, Mr. Langley. And maybe, just maybe, my ticket back to being something resembling a real reporter again. Losing Carl Newman, the notary, to the wind was a blow to the financial case. But Rowe's recording was pure dynamite for the murder charge. With Kevin now safely out of state and Rourke quietly building his own case against Corbin based on Rowe's intel, Ethan instructed his PR team to announce the date and time for the Claire Dawson Justice Fund press conference. The ripples of unease began to spread through Rosewood. The annual Rose Hill Foundation Charity Gala, a glittering affair held at the city's most exclusive hotel, buzzed with more than just champagne-fueled conversation. There was an undercurrent of tension, a frisson of nervousness. Ethan Langley, an unwelcome but powerful guest, via a last-minute, very substantial, anonymous donation that bought him a table, made his entrance. Walter Grayson's smile as he greeted his wealthy patrons was a fraction too bright, his eyes darting, assessing. Lydia Caldwell, elegant in black silk, exuded a venomous disdain when her gaze briefly met Ethan's. And Maria Grayson, adorned in emeralds that seemed to weigh her down, looked pale, her eyes wide and terrified, clinging to her husband's arm like a drowning woman. During a lull in the self-congratulatory speeches, Ethan approached Grayson's table. "Mr. Grayson, Mrs. Grayson," he said, his voice calm, but carrying easily in the suddenly hushed atmosphere. "A magnificent event. I trust the compassionate care Rose Hill provides will benefit greatly." He paused. "I did have some questions I hope to discuss with you regarding that care. Specifically regarding a former nurse, Claire Dawson, and a certain floral-covered notebook she was known to keep." Grayson paled visibly. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, the emeralds at her throat catching the light. Lydia Caldwell, ever the loyal soldier, stepped forward, her face a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Langley, this is hardly the time or the place for such baseless insinuations." "Isn't it?" Ethan pressed his gaze unwavering. "When better to discuss the truth than amongst those who so generously support Rose Hill's purported mission." "How dare you?" This is outrageous security. Grayson roared, his face, purpling, the carefully constructed mask of benevolence shattering. Get him out of here. As two burly security guards, part of Grayson's regular detail, began to move towards Ethan Maria, Grayson suddenly stood, her chair scraping loudly on the polished floor. Walter? No, she said, her voice trembling but surprisingly firm. Perhaps Mr. Langley. Perhaps he has a right to ask his questions. Maria, sit down and be silent. Grayson hissed, his eyes flashing with menace. But before the guards could reach Ethan, the grand ballroom doors burst open. Detective Frank Rourke, flanked by two uniformed officers, strode purposefully into the room, his expression grim. "You're Walter Grayson," Rourke announced, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and multiple other felonies." Chaos erupted. Cameras flashed from the press section, guests gasped and murmured, as Grayson was cuffed, snarling at Ethan. "You'll pay for this, Langley. You and that damned interfering brat. I'll ruin you, Benny the Brick." Rizzoli, who Ethan now recognized from the gala's catering staff, lunged from the edge of the crowd, not towards the arresting officers or Grayson, but directly at Ethan. A glint of steel, a short, vicious-looking knife, flashed in his hand. "You shouldn't have dug so deep, Mr. Moneybags." Benny snarled, his face contorted with rage. "Grayson pays well for loyalty. Because." Ethan braced himself, years of self-defense training kicking in. But before he could fully react, James Rowe, seemingly appearing from nowhere near the service entrance, launched himself at Benny with surprising speed and ferocity for a man of his dissipated appearance. The two men crashed heavily into a dessert trolley laden with champagne flutes and petit fours. The knife skittered across the polished dance floor. Uniformed officers quickly swarmed and subdued Benny. "Grayson's contingency plan, I'd wager." Rowe panted, rubbing a bruised shoulder as he was helped up by a grateful Ethan. Saw Benny get a subtle nod from Caldwell when Rourke walked in. Figured he wasn't just there to serve canapes. Rourke, after ensuring Benny was secured, turned back to the scene. Turns out, Carl Newman, the notary, didn't just skip town. He informed Ethan, a grim satisfaction in his voice. He drove straight to the nearest FBI field office and turned himself in, sang like a canary, implicated Grayson and Caldwell in everything from Medicare fraud to orchestrating Claire Dawson's murder. Said Caldwell hired local muscle Benny, being one of them, to run Claire off Old Mill Road. According to Newman, their initial plan was just to scare her, but Claire fought back. They suffocated her in her car, then staged the crash with Corbin's help. Corbin, cracked under questioning earlier today, confirmed most of it once he knew Newman was talking. "Your recording from Rowe Langley and all the evidence from Claire's notebooks and flash drive. It sealed the deal." Amidst the swirling confusion, Maria Grayson, tears streaming down her pale face. Her emeralds looking garish now, against her distress, approached Ethan, her husband's venomous glare following her. He was a monster. She whispered, her voice choked with a mixture of fear and a dawning fragile relief. "I lived with a monster in a beautiful prison. I was too scared to speak to leave. He threatened me, my family back in Argentina. But I'm not scared anymore. Not completely." She took a shaky breath. "I have records. Account statements, offshore transfers Walter thought I was too stupid to understand. And the locket Lydia Caldwell wore. Walter kept a safe in his private study. He called them his trophies. Small personal items from patients. There's a hidden compartment inside that antique silver locket of Mrs. Albright's. I saw him open it once, fiddling with it. I think he kept some kind of list in there, a personal tally." Maria Grayson, the silent woman in the gilded cage, was finally ready to speak. The locket wasn't just a trophy. It was potentially a key, a direct link to other victims inscribed by the architect of their demise. Despite Carl Newman's detailed confession and Sergeant Corbin's corroboration under pressure, the district attorney, bolstered by the mounting evidence from Claire's notebooks and Maria Grayson's impending testimony, agreed to an exhumation of Claire Dawson's body. It was deemed necessary not just for Kevin's ultimate peace of mind to dispel the horrifying notion of his mother being buried alive, but to gather definitive forensic evidence that might corroborate the killer's accounts of a struggle and asphyxiation prior to the staged crash. The cemetery was closed to the public, a grim, overcast morning casting a pall over the proceedings. Ethan stood a respectful distance from the raw earth of Claire's grave, accompanied by Tina Morales, her face etched with sorrow and a quiet resolve, and a somber Martha Jenkins, who had insisted on being present, a silent witness for Claire and the community. Detective Rourke and a team of forensic specialists were already on site, their movements efficient and somber. The air was cold, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, but another sharper, more acrid scent pricked at Ethan's nostrils. The faint, unmistakable tang of gasoline. He scanned the perimeter, his senses on high alert. As the gravediggers, their faces impassive, began their methodical work, their shovels biting into the resistant clay, a dark, unmarked SUV, which had been parked unobtrusively down a service lane, suddenly roared to life. Its tires skidded on the wet grass, spewing mud, as it burst through the flimsy police tape, cordoning off the exhumation site, heading directly for the forensic tent where delicate equipment was laid out. "Stop them!" Rourke yelled, drawing his weapon as officers scrambled, shouting. The SUV driven erratically swerved violently to avoid a collision with a police cruiser, careened across several graves, and crashed with a sickening crunch into a massive, ancient oak tree near the cemetery wall, its engine hissing steam. Officers swarmed the vehicle, guns drawn. A dazed and sobbing Shirley Baxter, the lead case manager from St. Michael's Home for Children, was pulled from the driver's seat. On the passenger seat beside her, tipped over and leaking, was a red canister of gasoline. A disposable lighter lay on the floorboard. "Grayson. Mr. Grayson. He made me..." She blubbered terror and desperation, making her almost incoherent as Rourke cuffed her. "He called last night. From jail somehow. Said I owed him after all his generous donations. Said I had to stop this. Create a distraction, a fire. Burn it. Burn the evidence. Burn the lies." Her voice trailed off into hysterical sobs. The desperation of a powerful man, even from behind bars, was a venom that could still find purchase. The grim work of the exhumation preceded the brief, violent interruption, only hardening the resolve of those present. Finally, the plain wooden casket was raised. It was opened carefully within the shielded forensic tent. Claire Dawson lay peacefully within, her features composed. There were no signs of any struggle within the coffin. Kevin's harrowing belief that she had been scratching was clearly born of a child's unbearable grief and vivid imagination, trying to make sense of the unthinkable, perhaps an unconscious interpretation of the earth settling, or the faint whispers he'd wished he could hear. The medical examiner, however, noted clear, though faint, bruising on her wrists and upper arms, consistent with a struggle before death. Fibers found under her fingernails, different from the coffin lining, were carefully collected. The preliminary on-site assessment, later confirmed by a full autopsy, was asphyxiation. She had been murdered before being placed in her car and sent crashing into that tree. Later, as the site was being cleared, and Claire's remains respectfully prepared for reinterment after the full autopsy. Martha Jenkins, her earlier words about the corrosive power of community silence still echoing in Ethan's mind, approached him. Her lined face was etched with a profound sadness, but also a quiet dignity. "It's done then," she said, her voice raspy. "The earth can rest easier now, knowing the truth is coming out." She held out a small, worn velvet pouch. "Young Kevin asked me last time I saw him before he..." went away for a bit. He asked me to put these on his mother's grave when she was finally resting properly, when the bad people couldn't hurt her anymore. Ethan opened the pouch. Inside were two small objects, a smooth gray stone polished by countless turns in a child's hand, and a single perfectly formed plastic blueberry from a craft set. A stone for remembering. Martha explained, her voice soft. So he'd never forget her. And a blueberry, he said, because she promised him blueberry pancakes for his birthday pancakes they never got to make. Her shrewd eyes, surprisingly clear, met Ethan's. That boy, he's got a piece of his mother's truth back now, Mr. Langley. Never underestimate what that means to a child, or what it costs when it's denied. Her gaze swept across the silent tombstones. Maybe now this town can start to reckon with its own silences too. Ethan nodded the small, simple tokens in his hand, feeling incredibly heavy. He understood. He understood all too well. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The Nightingale's Song and a Hidden Photograph, The Trial of Walter Grayson, Lydia Caldwell, Peterson Benny the Brick Rizzoli, and even a peripherally involved Sergeant Miles Corbin, quickly dubbed the Rose Hill Murders Trial, by the voracious media, became a statewide sensation. The prosecution, led by a steely-eyed district attorney, now armed with Millie McGregor's sharp insights, laid out a damning case. Claire Dawson's meticulously kept notebooks, James Rowe's chilling audio recording of Caldwell, ordering the hit, Maria Grayson's tearful but resolute testimony, detailing her husband's tyranny and his trophy collection, and Carl Newman's detailed account of years of systematic fraud and coercion. It was an avalanche of evidence. The most stunning revelation from Maria Grayson's testimony, however, came with the opening of Mrs. Albright's antique silver locket. Forensic experts, following Maria's hesitant directions, found the tiny, almost invisible catch to a hidden compartment. Inside, investigators found a minuscule, tightly rolled-up piece of parchment paper. On it, in Walter Grayson's distinctive spidery handwriting, was a coded list, initials, dates, and cryptic symbols. Cross-referenced with Rose Hill patient records and Claire's own notes, it corresponded to deceased patients whose assets had mysteriously vanished or been significantly donated to Grayson-controlled entities shortly before their deaths. It was Grayson's personal ledger of conquest and greed. Walter Grayson, on the stand, maintained an air of arrogant victimhood, blaming disgruntled employees, a vindictive wife, and an overzealous media. But confronted with the sheer, overwhelming weight of evidence, particularly Claire's notebook entries detailing his chillingly euphemistic, compassionate facilitation program, and the undeniable audio of Caldwell's murderous instructions, his carefully constructed facade finally spectacularly cracked. He didn't confess, not in the true sense of remorse. Instead, he erupted in a venomous tirade. She was a meddling, sanctimonious fool. He spat, his face contorted, pointing a shaking finger towards the prosecution table, where a photograph of Claire smiled benignly. They were old, useless. Their families had forgotten them. They were better off. Rose Hill was a mercy, a service I gave them, dignity, an easy passing eye. I was facilitating the inevitable with compassion. His outburst, a grotesque justification, rather than an expression of remorse, portraying himself as some kind of angel of mercy, rather than a cold-blooded killer and thief, sealed his fate more surely than any testimony. Life without parole. Lydia Caldwell received a similar sentence. Dr. Peterson, for his role in falsifying records and enabling the deaths, lost his license and faced a lengthy prison term. Benny the Brick, for his role as hired muscle, received a sentence for second-degree murder. Shirley Baxter, for her attempted arson and obstruction, also faced prison time, her career in social work unequivocally over. Sergeant Corbin, in exchange for his full cooperation, received a lesser sentence, but was stripped of his badge and pension, a disgraced cop. Rose Hill Elder Care Center was shuttered, its once gleaming facade now a monument to greed and corruption. But from its ashes, something new began to grow. Funded initially by a substantial endowment from Ethan Langley and spearheaded by a transformed Tina Morales, the Claire Dawson Foundation for Ethical Care and Whistleblower Protection was established. Its first major initiative, the Nightingale Initiative, aimed to become a national movement, advocating for sweeping reforms in elder care standards, demanding increased transparency, and championing robust legal and financial protections for whistleblowers like Claire. James Rowe, his career unexpectedly resurrected, launched a podcast, The Nightingale's Truth, the Claire Dawson story. Shot to the top of the charts, its unflinching account of Claire's bravery and Grayson's evil captivating millions, sparking a national conversation about the vulnerability of the elderly and the courage it takes to speak truth to power. The Foundation's first major public event was a community vigil held on a crisp autumn evening a year after Claire's death in Rosewood's town square. Hundreds of people gathered holding flickering candles against the twilight. Millie McGregor flew in from Arizona. Martha Jenkins sat in the front row, a quiet, dignified presence. Ethan, usually so private, found himself standing at the podium. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the shared sense of sorrow, outrage, and a tentative hope. His voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to suppress, read from a page that Tina had discovered tucked deep within the original Rosie the Riveter diary. A final sealed entry, a letter addressed to her son. "My dearest little star." It began Claire's familiar handwriting, filling the page, reaching out from beyond the grave. "If you are ever reading this, it means the shadows I was trying to fight found me before I could find the full light for us. Please, please know this, my brave, sweet boy. Everything I did, every note I took, every fear I faced, every prayer I whispered was for you. So you could grow up in a world where truth matters, where the vulnerable are protected, not preyed upon, where courage is valued more than silence. Don't ever let anyone, no matter how big or important they seem, silence your questions or dim your wonderful curiosity, Kevin. Your voice is precious. Your heart is good. Find your own light, my love, and shine so brightly the whole world can see. Know that my love for you is bigger than the sky, stronger than any monster, and deeper than the deepest ocean. Remember our songs, remember our tickle fights, remember the crescent moon on my wrist, and please always remember that I will always, always be with you, watching over my little star as you find your way through this world. Be brave. Be kind. Be you. All my love forever and a day, Mama." Tears flowed freely through the crowd as Claire's words, a testament to a mother's unwavering love and indomitable spirit, filled the square. Later, as the vigil drew to a close and people began to share their own stories, Tina Morales, her voice stronger and more confident than Ethan had ever heard it spoke. "Claire was my friend." Tina set her gaze sweeping over the assembled community. "Her courage has inspired us all. But there's one more piece to her bravery I only recently discovered." She held up a small, slightly creased photograph that had been tucked between the last pages of Claire's notebook. "I found this. It's Claire, meeting secretly with Maria Grayson about a month before Claire died. They're at a small, out-of-the-way cafe. Claire looks like she's listening intently. Maria looks terrified, but is clearly speaking, perhaps even passing Claire a slip of paper. Maria confirmed to me that she had tried in her own way to warn Claire to give her some information about Walter's hidden accounts, begging her to be careful. Maria was too frightened to do more then, but she tried. It doesn't excuse her silence, but it shows the complexities, the fear that can paralyze. Claire listened to her. She listened to everyone. That's what we must continue to do. Listen to the whispers, listen to the fearful, listen to the brave. Months later, the raw wounds of the trial had begun to scar over, though the memory of Claire Dawson's courage and Walter Grayson's depravity remained vivid in Rosewood's collective consciousness. Ethan and Kevin, now 7, and slowly reclaiming the stolen parts of his childhood, stood before Claire's new headstone. The plain stark marker had been replaced. This one read, "Claire Elizabeth Dawson, beloved mother, fearless nurse, she taught us to listen." Her song continues. A small, tasteful bouquet of wild blueberries nestled among pristine white lilies. An echo of Ethan's own long-standing ritual now shared, rested at its base. The cemetery was quiet today, bathed in the soft gold of a late spring afternoon. The wind still whispered through the trees, but today it sounded less like a mourner and more like a gentle sigh of peace. Kevin, his hand tucked securely in Ethan's, placed a carefully drawn picture at the foot of the stone. It depicted a smiling woman with a crescent moon on her wrist, holding hands with a small boy, both of them under a giant shining star. "Hi, Mom," he whispered, his voice still small but clear and steady now. "I miss you so much. You were so brave. You're my hero. Ethan says you helped a lot of people even though it was scary." He looked up at Ethan. His eyes, once so haunted now, held a quiet understanding, though the shadow of loss would always be there. "It still hurts sometimes, Ethan, when I remember. But it's not a scary hurt anymore. It's more like a brave hurt, like Mom's bravery. She would be so incredibly proud of you, Kevin." Ethan said, his arm tightening around the boy's small shoulders. So proud. You helped her tell her story, you know. You were the first one to make someone listen." Kevin leaned against him. "Are you going to stay, Ethan, for real?" Shirley said sometimes people say they'll stay, but then they get busy. Ethan knelt, bringing himself eye to eye with Kevin. He thought of his own childhood, of the revolving door of caseworkers, the fleeting hopes. "Kevin," he said, his voice imbued with a solemn promise, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm here. For you. Always. Like a dad is supposed to be. We're a family now, you and I. Different from other families maybe, but a family all the same. We'll figure it out together." A slow, wide smile, the kind Ethan hadn't seen often enough, spread across Kevin's face, reaching his eyes. "A dad," he echoed softly. "Okay. I think Mom would like that." He paused. "Can we go get blueberry pancakes now? It's Saturday. You promised." Ethan smiled, a genuine, unreserved smile that reached his own eyes, easing some of the long-held lines of tension around them. "Yes, Kevin," he said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Yes, we absolutely can. Your mom would insist." As they walked away from Claire's grave, hand in hand, sunlight broke definitively through the dissipating clouds, bathing the cemetery in a warm, hopeful glow. Before leaving Rosewood Cemetery, Ethan made one last stop alone. He walked to the older, unkempt section, to the simple, ivy-covered stone that marked his own mother's grave. He replaced the wilting lilies he'd left months ago with a single perfect purple lilac, her favorite. "I'm trying, Mom," he whispered to the silent stone. "I'm finally listening." Ethan thought of Claire's last letter to her son, of Kevin's quiet strength, of Martha Jenkins's regretful wisdom about the cost of communal silence, and Tina's newfound fiery advocacy. He looked beyond the cemetery gates at the reader, at the world beyond the page, a world full of unheard whispers and unseen injustices. "Have you ever stayed silent when injustice whispered in your ear?" he mused. "Have you ever dismissed a child's tentative truth, a woman's urgent warning, because it was uncomfortable or inconvenient or simply easier to look away? Claire Dawson had not. And her voice amplified first by a small grieving boy, and then by those who finally chose to listen, had sparked a reckoning that was still sending ripples across the country. The fortress around Ethan Langley's heart had not crumbled, but its gates were open now. New rooms were being built, rooms filled with purpose, with an empathy he no longer feared, with the enduring, resonant echo of a nightingale's song. The past still whispered its sorrows, but now so did the future, with a tentative melody of hope. And for the first time in a life defined by proving his worth against a backdrop of loss, Ethan Langley looked towards the rising sun not as a challenge to be conquered, but as a promise to be embraced. The journey of listening, he now understood, was not just about uncovering darkness, but about allowing new light to flood in. For a small boy who deserved a future, for a community learning to heal, for all who dared to believe that truth, however fragile or fiercely guarded, could indeed rise and sing its song. He hoped the Nightingale Initiative would inspire many more to join that chorus. It was time for everyone to listen.